since the Kursk maneuver, it's changing. And some of his staunchest supporters, some of the staunchest Russian bots and propagandists are now questioning what on earth's going on. What is Putin up to? Has he lost the plot? I'm Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, a former British Army officer and military analyst, and also a NATO commander. Well, I think everybody's well aware that in the conflict in Ukraine, we've seen over the last sort of 900 plus days, the extensive use of drones. And lots of people are thinking this is a new way of warfare, a new way of fighting. But it's not really. It's just an extension of what we call combined arms maneuver warfare. And no side really in this conflict so far has been able to make any significant breakthroughs because they haven't been able to synchronize tanks and artillery and infantry and air power and drones, which are, a part of air power, they're part of artillery, they're a part of a whole host of things. And what we've seen develop, particularly, I think, with the Kursk maneuver, the Kursk incursion, which has been really the biggest land grab really in this war, and one that has been sustained. It's not unlike the First World War, where the trenches moved by meters each day and over the years. And really, we've seen that in the last 2.5 years in Ukraine, where the trench systems have barely moved. However, Kursk is very different. Ukrainians have managed to take, it would appear, about 1,500 square kilometers of Russia, which is extraordinary. And drones have been key to this. But what they've managed to do is synchronize drones with all the other military capabilities they have to overwhelm the Russian defenders. And in this particular case, what we've seen is mass drones, thousands of drones, what we call surveillance drones. And these are ones with cameras on them, which are showing the operators on the ground exactly what is ahead. They're also drones that have what we call electronic countermeasures, which can blind the Russians who are trying to knock down drones and missiles, and also trying to eavesdrop on the conversation of Ukrainian commanders in tanks and on the ground. Now, so those drones can nullify that. And we also have attack drones, the first-person view drones that everybody's seen. And they go ahead of the main body, if you like, which would be formed of tanks and infantry. And these attack drones and surveillance drones are really obliterating the Russian defenders. And we've seen that really for the first time with the Kursk counter move. And the way that they've broken through. The other thing that Ukrainians have managed to do here is operational security. In other words, keep it secret, which has been very, very difficult. Everybody talks about the transparent battlefield in Ukraine because basically there's so many drones in the sky with cameras. But actually, you can counter that with, as I said, with drones that have electronic measures to be able to cut that out. So that is what we've seen. And that's the piece in the Times that is very clearly describing, because the importance of the Kursk incursion and creating, in effect, a Kursk salient. And the Ukrainians are digging in now, because Zelensky has very clearly articulated, and again, it is in this piece, that the key element to this operation is to put the Ukrainians in a position where they can negotiate a peace settlement from a position of strength, because Kursk is in the DNA of the Russian people. It's where hundreds of thousands of Russians were killed when they managed to turn back the Nazi forces in 1943. And rightly, this is seen as a key turning point in the Second World War. So to lose this hallowed ground, it absolutely goes to the heart. And it's created what we call a sort of black swan event, which is an event that appears to be completely random and a surprise, but actually, there's foundation behind it. And as President Zelensky has said, he wants those 300,000 refugees, which are now marching east, to tell Putin and the Russian people exactly what is happening. And also, the Russians have had to throw thousands of conscripts, young recruits, into Kursk to try and plug the gap. And these young conscripts are untrained and are dying in their absolute thousands. And their parents are now beginning to understand and realize this. And the other significance of the conscripts is the Russian army is really, in a very difficult position. They are now having to get recruits from the middle classes, the wealthy, the elite in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and their parents, who are all Putin's, close friends. They didn't sign up for this. When Putin launched his special military operation that's supposed to last 3 days on the 24th of February 2022, the elite didn't think they'd be involved. They're getting involved. So a really smart move led by these drone squads it's what we call a tactical, a sort of low-level engagement, but are having a strategic impact because it's making Putin really think what happens next. And I personally think he is really rattled and stuck what to do next. I think one of the key things that we know that the elite in Moscow are being affected is, every night there are these TV programs like Newsnight, like News at 10, where people, and Question Time, where people dissect everything that's happening in the battlefield. And generally, it's all, very pro-Putin. It's a diatribe of Putin's military brilliance. However, since the Kursk maneuver, it's changing. And some of his staunchest supporters, some of the staunchest Russian bots and propagandists, are now questioning what on earth's going on. What is Putin up to? Has he lost the plot? And they're also discussing this fact that, that the young of the elite are now having to go to conscription centres, pick up their rifles and get trained. Whereas hitherto, the Russian army has been made up of ethnic Russians from Eastern Russia and criminals. I mean, there's even a story this week where a criminal who had murdered somebody was released, went to the front, did his 6 months, went back to Russia, murdered a granny, I think in her 90s, went to jail, and then was sprung from jail and back on the front. I mean, this is the sort of thing that is the Russian army. So now these elite kids, as it were, are being thrown into the meat grinder. Their parents, who are in a position of influence but rely on Putin. I mean, Putin is an autocratic leader. He rules absolutely rigidly. There's no democracy in Russia, and his close friends are paid off with money and bribes and land and God knows what else. But now that they're starting to question it, Putin is in thin ice, and the temperature in Moscow is getting warmer by the day. I think the Kursk operation, absolutely, as Kursk did for Hitler in 1943, there is a very strong chance that it could do for an equally evil tyrant, Putin, in 2024. However, it is absolutely down to the West to make sure that happens. As Zelensky has said many times, he wants to be able to use Western weaponry to strike Russian forces in Russia. And he has a team today in Moscow asking the Americans if they can strike targets, because, what Russia is doing in response to the Kursk maneuver is to target the infrastructure in Ukraine, the power grid, their nuclear power stations, with missiles that are launched from aircraft, from airfields, a couple of hundred miles into Russia. Now, Zelensky 2 weekends ago asked our new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, to use the British Storm Shadow to do this. And unfortunately, the new government have not allowed them to do it, which to me seems crazy. At the moment, Ukraine is fighting with one hand behind its back, and Russia has the freedom of maneuver to attack Ukraine from wherever it likes. However, if the UK and the US gave the permission to strike these targets, then I think absolutely Kursk 2024 could be very similar to Kursk 1943 and bring down another tyrant. Well, I think what we're seeing next in Kursk is the Ukrainians consolidating their position. They're digging in. But a key part of that defense is also the drone teams, because defense is not a one-dimensional thing. It's not just about digging trenches, because, of course, the Russians will attack in a three-dimensional environment. So the role of the drone teams now are very much defense. It's these surveillance drones who are keeping an eye on exactly what the Russian forces are doing, where they're maneuvering. And the attack drones, as we're seeing, are taking out those Russian tanks that are trying to maneuver into a position to retake the Kursk salient. So they have a critical role to play. And, it's something that we in this country will no doubt be learning, that they play a critical part in, our future defence and our future military, where hitherto Britain has relied on a few very expensive drones, but we're sort of seeing actually it's much better to spend that money probably on thousands of cheap drones that are expendable rather than a few that are not. So I'm sure they will be a key element in this consolidation in Kursk. And at the moment, it would appear to seem that whoever wins the drone battle has the advantage, but it does seem to be a numbers game, and that's a lesson that hopefully we are learning in this country, which I'm sure we are, and I'm sure they will play a key element to this in future. But fundamental, I think, to the Kursk operation is for Britain and the US and France to allow Ukraine to use our donated long-range missiles to attack targets in Russia, so that they cannot attack hospitals, schools, and power stations in Ukraine.